Okay, so I'm just going to take some time to talk about the 1994 Aquaman series by Peter David. Um, I haven't read all of it. I've read I've read these two volumes, obviously, but beyond that, I've only read maybe like a handful of issues, around issue number 40 to 43, somewhere around there. Back when it was first published in single issue format. But these have been released recently. Aquaman by Peter David, Book 1 and Book 2. Now, for those that are not familiar, Aquaman, you probably know by now, this is his classic look that he had for, from the 50s right on through, the early 90s, I guess it was. And then in 1994, Peter David kind of came in and took the book over, or relaunched the book, and gave Aquaman long, shaggy hair and a beard and a harpoon for a hand, because they wanted to change things up a bit for Aquaman and get away from the idea that he was just a guy that swam in the ocean and talked to fish, which he does still, but they wanted to make him more of a badass, because that was big in the 90s. That was when everything was extreme. So this series picks up after the Sean McLaughlin Aquaman series. For those who weren't familiar, that series ran for about 14 issues before it was canceled, and then was relaunched, if you will, with Aquaman Time and Tide, which was a 4-issue miniseries that was basically a year one story for Aquaman. And it basically changes up a lot of stuff in Aquaman's origins. Originally in the I think original history, Aquaman was his father was a lighthouse keeper and his mother was a woman from Atlantis. And Peter David changes that up a bit so that his father is now a ancient Atlantean wizard named Atlan. So he does take some liberties with the character and change a few things up. He has an affair early on with a woman from Alaska, I believe it is, or the Antarctic. And they end up having a son together named Koryak, who makes his debut in this series. And becomes a fairly big character during Peter David's run. And he gets into some really kind of weird stuff, at least in terms of weird for Aquaman fans, I think, because it starts out this series with a lot of dreams and nightmares and, prophecies. That's probably the most famous for Aquaman losing his hand, because his hand was eaten by piranha at one point. That's how he loses his hand. Thanks to the thanks to a villain called Charybdis, who is probably his one claim to fame. He doesn't really have much of a costume, and he's I don't think he really made any more appearances after this. But the first 8 issues plus Time and Tide are collected in the first volume here. And there are a lot of good stories. This is his new look, by the way, for what he had pre-New 52. You can see the harpoon hand and his armor here on his new pants. And he started a relationship with Dolphin. Which was kind of a strange thing for people, because they were used to seeing Aquaman with his wife Mira, and she had left him after the death of their son, Arthur Jr., which you can read about in the Aquaman Death of a Prince saga, which is also in trade. But for a while she was gone from the comics and came back briefly, very briefly, in an issue during the Sean McLaughlin one, where it was shown that she was a prisoner of a guy named Thanatos, who was this evil version of Aquaman from another dimension. And it was only just like a one-issue thing back in the Sean McLaughlin area, but Thanatos and Mera do come back in full for probably a 3 or 4 issue story arc in book 2 of the Peter David run here, which also includes Aquaman number 8 to 20 and the Aquaman annual number 1. And this is where things get really weird. Again, like I said, there was a lot of, in the first volume, there's a lot of dreams and nightmares and prophecies that Arthur has to go through. And again, they changed his name because his father is no longer Arthur Curry, Lighthouse Keeper. It's Atlan, so apparently his real name, quote unquote, is Orin. O-R-I-N. So everyone in this book calls him Aquaman or Arthur or Orin, which is what Dolphin refers to him as. But it does get into some strange stuff. Like I said, it's basically at some point it becomes clear that Atlantis is rising up from the ocean and becoming it's coming to the surface. And apparently it has something to do with the alien ship that's been underneath Atlantis for millennia. Because apparently aliens came down and killed all the dinosaurs and then basically created Atlantis and all the people. It's a weird twist to the Aquaman mythos, and I know that a lot of old school hardcore Aquaman fans are not happy about some of that stuff because it takes away from, I don't know if it takes away from it, but it kind of ignores some of the past mythology about Aquaman. And there you can see Mera back again. And that's Thanatos, the evil Aquaman, who has a version of the costume Aquaman wore briefly for about 4 issues back in the 1980s, I want to say. You know, there's an Aquaman miniseries that he wore it in. His camouflage costume, if you will. Again, the stories are pretty good here, but it does get weird, like I said, with the bad guy from another dimension and Aquaman having to go around to all these ancient hidden Atlantean cities or underwater cities trying to raise an army against this incoming alien invasion from outer space. So if you've ever read like a lot of Peter David stuff, he takes kind of classic comic book characters, especially DC characters. I'm not real familiar with his Marvel work, aside from a few issues of Incredible Hulk. But he does take characters like Supergirl, who at the time in the 90s was a shape-shifting alien from another dimension called Matrix, who took on the Supergirl identity. And Peter David took that and basically turned her into an angel from heaven that grew wings made of fire. And, you know, and this horse comet was an alien sort of thing that could transform into a human. He takes things that are already weird and just makes them weirder, which is, it might work for something like Doom Patrol, but for characters like Supergirl and Aquaman, it's kind of hit or miss. But I've always been curious as to what he would do with like one of DC's stranger books like Doom Patrol like that. He might be really good at that. But overall, like I said, this is the kind of the stories that put Aquaman back on the map, because for a while he couldn't hold his own series. Now this Aquaman series in particular ran for 75 issues. And Peter David wrote 48 of those, if you can include the number 0 issue. And he has one of the more famous runs, certainly before Jeff Johns came along and rebooted everything again with New 52. He has probably what is the most well-known Aquaman run before New 52 and Rebirth. And this, I should point out, this also is the start of the story where Aqualad, aka Garth, becomes Tempest. He doesn't take that name here, but he's on the path to becoming Tempest, and he does take up the name later in future issues or future volumes, I think. But like I said, I haven't really read most of those. But overall, like I said, you do get some classic characters in here, like Ocean Master does turn up, Thanatos, Mera, Aqualad / Garth / Tempest, Dolphin, and even some characters that were more obscure at the time, like King Icula from Sean McLaughlin's Aquaman run, which hasn't been reprinted yet, but hopefully they will at some point. But overall, it looks like it's a pretty good series, and it does take Aquaman. It does put him back into the spotlight, or did at the time in the 1990s. This was around 1994, 1995 that these were published originally. And before that, like I said, Aquaman was kind of, he was considered a silly character, or a character that was really not all that powerful and really not all that popular. He was known for being in cartoons more than he was in comics. He was because in the Justice League stories, you know, if he was in Justice League, they had to keep finding ways to use him around water, which is kind of hard when most of the Justice League stories take place in space or in a city like Metropolis. So he wasn't really considered all that useful as a superhero, but his kingdom does cover 3/4 of the Earth's surface. And this is kind of, in the Peter David run, is where they establish that he has a very large lung capacity, and that his skin is like really, really tough. Like he can withstand bullets. You know, he's not bulletproof per se. He can still bleed, but they don't hurt him like they would a normal human. They kind of scratch his skin more than anything else. They don't really penetrate it too much. And it kind of makes him, like I said, into a badass. And Jeff Johns picked up on some of this stuff in his run later on in the New 52. And you can see just by looking at the appearance, like the yellow hair, the long yellow hair and the beard, he does look like Jason Momoa in the Aquaman movie that's coming out in December. I think it's December 14th it comes out, which is just over a month away now. So I know that in the introduction for book 1, Peter David has said that, you know, that the first thing that people said when they saw the seeing Jason Momoa in costume as Aquaman for the first time, the first thing that happened was they said, "Oh, he looks just like Peter David's Aquaman." And you know, now everyone's expecting him to have a harpoon for a hand, not a hook, but a harpoon, because that's, you know, I always love that panel. I don't know why. It just always struck me as really cool. But yeah, check it out if you can find these in your local comic book store, and you can still find back issues if you want to get them cheaper. Because this ranges from $30 US to $40 Canadian, which is where I am in, and same for book 2. So they're about $30 to $40 a piece for the 2 volumes, and like I said, there'll probably be volume 3 and volume 4. Hopefully fairly soon, because they take forever to print these out. But they are an interesting part of Aquaman's history, and they did put him back in the map after, like I said, after I don't know, a decade or more of being kind of the joke of the Justice League, if you will. But it did make him into a kind of a badass. I think that's where Jeff Johns got most of his ideas from for his series, to make Aquaman more of a powerhouse, if you will. And the rest, as I say, is history. So you can check these out at your local comic book store. You can order them online from Amazon or In Stock Trades, or wherever you get comics from, and dig into some old school Aquaman.